Vanilla World of Warcraft had so much cut content that there are dozens upon dozens of things that are just not finished in this amazing world. But there are probably things you haven't even heard about that were cut from the game and make the world drastically more interesting if they were ever to be added back. But before I list these amazing ideas, let's talk about some of the things that people already know about. For example, Hyjal, Karazhan Tower being finished, Grim Batol, and things of that nature. All really cool things, the things that you have heard of before. But did you know that Vanilla WoW was originally meant to be up to level 70? That's not something you've probably heard of before. Now, before I dive too much into that, I should probably clarify why it was meant to be up to level 70. When WoW was first being made, it was a drastically bigger game, and the desires and visions for vanilla were a lot higher. They had pretty lofty goals that just reached for the heavens, and they had to scrap so much of it because there was just nowhere near enough time to make all of it. And the reason for that is pretty simple. Warcraft 3 and World of Warcraft were being developed at the same time. WoW's development started in 1999, in fact a little bit earlier than that as well. So they had all these plans and ambitions, and the storylines and the plot points and so many things were just changed and evolved in ways that make World of Warcraft what they are today. But World of Warcraft being level 70 was just one of the few ideas that got cut. And it wasn't even the biggest change. That was very early on in World of Warcraft's development. But instead of talking about a concept, now let's move on to an idea that got cut from the game, and that is the Dark Iron Highway. Now, Blackrock Depths and the Blackrock Mountain was a ginormous location that took about 7 months to be brought to fruition. And that was 7 months of non-stop dedicated work by all the designers and developers. But Blackrock Depths was just meant to be bigger and bigger than it actually was. Now, in vanilla, just before it was launched, they only had about 4 years, about 5-ish total, to finish this entire world. And they didn't have enough time to put all the things they wanted in Blackrock Mountain into the game. And that brings us to the Blackrock Mountain's mysterious Dark Iron Highway. Now, the Dark Iron Highway is this continental highway system that was initially meant to connect all the Dwarven empires together. So Ironforge all the way to Grim Batol. Now, this is all very early lore, and most of it was cut. It's not canon, it hasn't been canon in a long time. But this is a talk about vanilla ideas that were cut, not the current canon. And the lore behind it is actually really interesting. Now, if you don't know, Emperor Thracian and the Dark Iron Dwarves summoned Ragnaros to stop the Ironforged Dwarves and the Wildhammer Dwarves from defeating them. And in this case, the Dark Irons were the aggressors. They lost, pulled the ultimate gotcha moment, and then lost even harder when Ragnaros leveled everything and created the Blackrock Mountain Burning Steppes area that you know in the current lore. But that's just pieces of the lore that all connect to this mysterious ancient Dwarven empire, all these amazing things. And in this case, in a Vanilla Plus or a Classic Plus or whatever you want to call it, they should revisit this and expand upon the Dark Iron Highway. I want to know what plans they had cooking. Go into Metzen's notes, because they still have them apparently, and find what his original visions and ideas were, and finish them. Or at least let us know. Because what is behind Baelgar in the Dark Iron Highway? But don't let me drag on about the Dark Iron Highway, I'll spend hours talking about that. So let's move on to the next thing you didn't know about. Zuldare and Tol'barad, two islands that have significance from Warcraft 2, have some plot points in Warcraft 3, but we didn't actually see about them again until Cataclysm for Tol'barad, and actually never again for Zuldare. Now, these islands are right there inside World of Warcraft. If you look at all these old maps, you can see where they were. In fact, Zuldare was a staging point that the Orcish Horde used in the Second War to launch a lot of invasions, battle tactics, and it let them attack northern eastern kingdoms. And it was meant to be in the game. They even thought the design process, the OG maps, all the lore plot points that they had pointed to Zuldare being in game, but they never even started development of it. And it makes me wonder what reason they had for scrapping Zuldare, because they began the Isle of Dr. Lepidus and a few other islands in game, which are already in game right now. You can even access them, they're just locked. But they never started Zuldare. And I don't know what the main reason it was for the devs to remove this process and remove this island from being developed. It had a lot of key integral features that are just relevant to the lore at the time. Not so much anymore because the world has changed again. The in-game canon and the modern canon is drastically different to Vanilla's canon. But moving on from Zuldare, we're going to touch more upon Tol'barad. Now, Tol'barad was brought into the lore in Cataclysm, And they did expand upon the Kul Tirans in Battle for Azeroth, but the OG Tol'barad and the OG Kul Tiras lore was different. Admiral Proudmoore, Jaina, all those storylines and plot points, they changed over time. The OG Tol'barad would have been an interesting location. It would have had Kul Tirans in game, out of that faction, maybe even a reputation. I don't know what the plot points were for vanilla, because all the things you can find about OG vanilla are just scraps of information here or there, a dev leaking something by accident, or a dev just going into an interview or just talking about it on their Twitch streams or on Twitter just randomly on a whim. And to be fair, I honestly wouldn't be surprised if most of the original writers forgot what their plot points were. So we have to guess and correlate based on information they left in game or their notes and things they've said online. Now, if you remember, earlier on I said that Warcraft 3 and World of Warcraft began development at about the same time. Now, this is something that may really surprise you, but Jaina was meant to be the original Banshee Queen, not Sylvanas. Sylvanas was a throwaway character that wasn't relevant to the Frozen Throne. And the Frozen Throne DLC essentially made her a more important character and added her story arc. But if you look at Warcraft 3's original voice lines, you can hear Jaina dying. You can hear her torment, her pain. Again, a scrap story beat. But imagine how different the story and the world would be if they chose to go with that OG storyline of Jaina becoming the Banshee Queen, and how much different Azeroth and Lordaeron would be. And story-wise, it would have made more sense as well. Jaina leading the Forsaken has much more impact and power to the story than Sylvanas does. A High Elf leading the Forsaken is drastically different than Jaina, Arthur's love interest, and her opponent in the Scourge vs. the Forsaken game. It's an amazing plot feat, but this is alternate timeline scenarios because we can't go back and change the lore that much. At this point, everyone loves Sylvanas, controversial take, and people love Jaina, controversial take. So they can't change this, but it is an interesting scrapped idea on the OG old lore that developed into what it is in the modern day. But talking about another thing that changed because of Warcraft 3 and WoW are hero classes. That's right, hero classes were meant to be in World of Warcraft. The reason they're not, they ran out of time and money. That's the main reason. There was no grand conspiracy. They had a timeline they had to meet, and they could not meet it if they were going to make hero classes. That's why certain classes in vanilla feel so terrible. They weren't meant to be in that state. They were meant to be finished and expanded upon. For example, warlocks having metamorphosis and things of that nature were designed and planned. Blade Master from Warcraft, Mountain King from Warcraft, all of those specs, those hero specs were meant to come into WoW. But money, timelines, deadlines made it so that we never got hero classes. But it's also mildly sad that we're still using OG vanilla ideas in retail to this day. And talking about classes, did you guys know that in the original plan for World of Warcraft, there was no rogues and druids were not part of the plan? Instead, we had assassins and Runemasters. Now, Runemasters ended up becoming Death Knights in Wrath of the Lich King. The whole concept and plan for it turned into Death Knights, all the runes that they use. But assassins turned into, and then they added druids instead of Runemasters, and that's the vanilla classes that we have. Now, Runemasters were an interesting class. The design philosophy behind it was interesting, but they never really fleshed it out. They put it to the side because they couldn't figure out a way to put it into the lore. Now, why did they turn into Death Knights? Because the original Death Knight hero class just didn't make sense, and they took Runemaster's skill set and made that Death Knights instead. But imagine if they added Runemasters to vanilla WoW, or Classic Plus in this case. How interesting and how different would the lore and the story and the classes be in modern WoW today if Runemasters had stayed in game? But talking about the OG classes, Assassin turning into Rogue is not a real big difference. It's essentially the same thing, just a different name. I'm sure the Assassin skill set and talents and abilities might have been mildly different, but Rogue and Assassin is the same thing. There's nothing really major there to change or worry about. I'm going to talk about a topic that some people have heard about, but not everybody has, and that is the Caverns of Time. The Caverns of Time was initially slated for vanilla. It was meant to be in game. In fact, the Black Morass dungeon is fully finished. The doodads are a bit wonky, so it doesn't work correctly. But the whole Black Morass dungeon instance was designed for vanilla WoW. It was part of the original 30 dungeons they had planned for vanilla. That's another topic I'm going to cover later in the video. And the reason the Caverns of Time was locked in vanilla is because they couldn't get the doodads and the timeline and the stories to work, mainly because Warcraft 3 took so long to develop and there were several delays in the development of Warcraft 3 and World of Warcraft. So they had to scrap a lot of the Caverns of Time ideas and push them forward to TBC and onwards, as they did finish them off later in time. But not just Black Morass, Durnhold Keep and a few other dungeon designs in TBC were all vanilla slated content. Now again, the devs, much like most other things on this list and video you're listening to right now, didn't have the time to finish, or the manpower, or the money, because the budget was limited and they had so many projects they were working on. But Caverns of Time being a vanilla would have been a huge difference into the gameplay and the story loop that we'd be experiencing. They may have ended up expanding on the Caverns of Time much more if it was an OG vanilla system. And then moving on to the next point, 30 dungeons and much more raids than we actually got were slated for vanilla. Now, you guys have to realize that the initial world map that they drew was drastically different to the world map that we ended up with. Kalimdor was a bit wonky, there were way more landmasses, so many more islands, but budget and timeline. I've said that several times in this video, but that's the main reason a lot of these vanilla ideas never came to fruition. Now, these 30 dungeons, I did name a few of them already. Karazhan had a dungeon component, there were more BRD dungeons slated, Caverns of Time and Black Morass. But some others you may never have heard about are the Evacuation Site, a Dwarven dungeon, Grim Batol, which was meant to be a dungeon and a raid, Ashenvale Ruins was a dungeon that was meant to be in-game, Skullrock for the Horde, or the Orcs in this case, which I think turned into Ragefire Chasm, but I can neither confirm nor deny that, I'm not actually sure. The Silithid Hive, which I think was split into multiple dungeons, which then got turned into AQ20. Again, I can neither confirm nor deny exactly what happened to the Silithid Hive concept. And then Ajara was meant to have a dungeon, but some people think it's a raid, and I'm not sure exactly. A lot of the dev notes and dev images are very blurry, hard to actually read, and they're just images that are over 20 years old, so the quality of these images is really hard to decipher. Again, there are more concepts that were initially included, scrapped, reworked, and became different dungeons. But I'm going to list a few more that you may never have heard about. The Abandoned Tauren Dungeon, the Talon Dungeon in Stone Talon Mountains. Yes, they had a dungeon plan there, never really came to fruition. Tol'barad, the Siege of Airy Peak, the Dragonmoor had a dungeon tied with them, the Diamond Mines in STV. Not sure exactly what that dungeon slash raid was meant to be, but it was part of the original concepts. And I'm just gonna stop right there, because I could theorycraft on every single one of these original abandoned ideas, but this video would be 5 hours long. But let me know in the comments if you want a 5-hour long video where I break down every abandoned OG idea and what it would look like in the modern day, for example in Classic Plus or retail. Now, there are two things I have left to cover. The first one of those two is the Dark Portal. Now, if some of you remember playing Warcraft 3, you guys will recall there being multiple Dark Portals in one of the Outland missions. And in fact, in OG Vanilla's Alpha, or Pre-Alpha as they'd call it, there were actually multiple Dark Portal entrances which led to the Outlands, or multiple different dungeons in these locations. These portals were meant to open to different parts of destroyed Outland, and they were meant to be dungeons. Again, a scrapped idea that never really came around to finishing it because the story in Warcraft 3 changed, Illidan ended up destroying a lot of these dark portals, yada yada yada. But the OG dark portal was actually in Teldrassil, and then they moved the dark portal from there to Ajara, and then they decided that it didn't really fit Ajara, but it was meant to be an underwater dark portal entrance which took you to a demon realm of some sort, and you were meant to fight a few bosses in there, maybe it might have been a raid instead. And then they decided that this doesn't really work for what we're trying to do. Again, budget and timing. So they moved it to the Blasted Lands because the Blasted Lands had nothing going for it. So they made Blasted Lands the location they put the Dark Portal in. Now, I wonder how the world and lore and story would be if they kept that OG idea of there being multiple Dark Portals. Like, how exactly would the story have changed when they made Outland and TBC? Would there have been 3 or 4 entrances to Outland? Would they have kept it that these were different locations? Maybe they would have expanded upon these OG vanilla dungeons or raids that they were there, and you could visit them from TBC as well. But again, never came to fruition. But for Classic Plus, I actually kind of hope they go back to it and add more Dark Portals and kind of follow the storyline of OG Vanilla or Alpha Vanilla. I want to see what the devs can cook by finishing off these story beats. And now for the 10th and final scrapped vanilla content you may have never heard about. Goblins were meant to be a playable race in vanilla. Gnomes and trolls and goblins were meant to be 3 extra races added to be playable races for the player base. Now, everybody knows about gnomes and trolls, you can play them both, but gnomes never made it. In fact, until Cataclysm, they were not a playable race. And I don't know what the reason for cancelling that was. Was the main reason because they didn't want to add a neutral race and they couldn't figure out how to do it? Or was there meant to be an extra alliance race that was scrapped as well? Where Worgen, for example, meant to be a race alongside goblins. This is very early pre-conceptual things. This was before the world was even finished being properly designed, which meant at some point in the development pipeline, they decided that, screw it. We can't add goblins because Worgens don't work correctly, so no Worgens and no goblins. And then guess what happens in Cataclysm? Worgens and goblins. So based off of everything I've told you guys, there was meant to be more races, more classes, more specs, more zones, more dungeons, more raids, just more locations overall that we never got to see. But the developers took on and finished in later expansions and later seasons. And honestly, with Classic Plus being on the horizon, the dev team should go back and finish OG Vanilla and the OG intentions. For example, in the Caverns of Time, add a timeline where Jaina becomes the Banshee Queen. Because why not? It was part of the OG plans that got scrapped. And I would honestly love to see some of this come to fruition and be engaging, interesting content in the future. Thank you all for watching. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe. If you hated the video, like and subscribe so you can hate all my content. Don't be a half-assed hater, be dedicated. Thank you all, Ebonhard out.